I think it's recording now, right? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the University of Oxford Southernising Criminology discussion group. My name is Luis. I'm here with my co-convener and fellow DPhil student, Lucy Harry. We are thrilled to have so many people here today, professors, students, researchers, and also to have people joining us from all over the world. In forming this group, we aim to facilitate some discussions about criminology that move away from the hegemonic Western paradigm to then encompass some perspectives from the global South. And here at the center, we have many students and academics researching criminal justice issues in a number of jurisdictions across the globe, and this including also many in the Southern Hemisphere. And so we hope these events will complement and enhance our scholarship. But before we start, we'd like to acknowledge and thank several people for their help and support with all this stuff and setting up this discussion group. In particular, our senior member, Professor Caroline Hawley, our head of department, Professor Mary Bosworth, Marina Miconi from the Law Faculty Events team, and Angela Patterson, one of the center's administrators. As without you all, this wouldn't have been possible. So we are absolutely delighted to have with us this afternoon one of the leading scholars of Southern criminology, Professor Máximo Sozzo, to start off our discussion series by addressing the central question of why Southernising criminology. Máximo Sozzo is Professor of Sociology and Criminology at the National University of Litoral, Argentina. He was a fellow at the University of New York Law School and at the University of Bologna Institute of Advanced Studies. He's been a visiting professor in several universities and also published several books, articles, and chapters on many different topics in criminology. You can find his work in Spanish, English, Portuguese, Italian, and Mandarin. I'd also like to briefly seize this opportunity to mention that Máximo and I are organizing a workshop on punishment in global peripheries. This event will take place on the 24th and 25th of June. The call for papers is still on, so if you want to send us an abstract, please go ahead. Okay, before I hand over to Professor Máximo Sozzo, Lucy will provide you with some information about the event structure and so on. So Lucy, over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, just to echo what Louise has just said, it's so wonderful to have so many people here and to have such a distinguished speaker to kick us off. I just have a few housekeeping things. I mean, I'm sure that you're all extremely familiar with participating in Teams meetings by now, but just a reminder to please mute yourself during the talk. And the structure of this event will be Professor Sozzo will speak for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll have between 30 minutes to an hour of a Q&A, depending on how many questions there are. Please hold off asking questions until this Q&A section, at which point, if you would like to ask a question, please can you write the letter Q in the chat box, and then Louise and I will call upon you in turn to unmute yourselves and ask Professor Sozzo the question, or you're more than welcome to write it in the chat box if you'd prefer. Just a reminder that we are recording the presentation section, but we will be turning off the recording for the Q&A. So if you'd not like to be included on the recording, just remember to turn off your camera right now. But that's all I have to say. And yeah, I'll hand over to you, Professor Sozzo. I think you might be muted.
Now it's okay. thank you very much, Luis and Lucy, for this very kind invitation to participate in this kickoff of the discussion group on Southern Criminology at the University of Oxford. It's a great pleasure to be here with so many friends and people all over the world. So I will try to share my screen because I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. I think, I don't know now.
You're sharing.
Sorry, Lucy and Luis, I think that, now it's okay, great. I think now I can do it. Yeah. So I will.
Sorry, Máximo, you were sharing your screen, but you are not now. So if
sorry,
you could
I didn't.
Yeah, now you are again. Yeah, now it's on. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Yes, right. Sorry, but I am not so used to Meet. I usually have lived my life in this last year on Zoom more than Meet, so that's great. So Lucy and Luis asked me to talk about why Southernising Criminology, and I think it's a very, very interesting and challenging title. I have participated with several other colleagues like Kerry Carrington, Russell Hawke, John Scott, and Rhys Walters in building this collective project that we called initially Southern Criminology, that tries to problematize, resist, and change the relations of hierarchy, dependency, and subordination between the global North and South in the production of knowledge in the complex and polyvalent field of the social studies of the criminal question. We organized a handbook on criminology and the global South in 2018, and then we published a book more recently in 2019 with this title, Southern Criminology. In doing this series of texts, we had important sources of inspiration in the contemporary debate in social theory more general, particularly the work by Raewyn Connell and Boaventura de Sousa Santos. But also we have interacted with different key precedents. Sorry, you said something, Luis? Is everything okay? No, okay. So we also interacted with several key precedents in the field that were produced during the emergence and consolidation of critical criminology, like, for example, some articles by Stan Cohen in the British context, or some articles and books by Rosa del Olmo and Raúl Zaffaroni in the Latin American context. And of course, in the last 2 decades, there were growing crucial interventions relating to counter-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial criminology. With these different interventions, we also made different kind of dialogues because there are strong levels of intersection and possibilities of fertilization. There are other recent precedents that anticipated some points raised in our work by some recent works by Katia Francoaz or Raúl Zaffaroni and Rodrigo Codino. My own participation in all this collective project is related to my previous research on the travels of ideas about the criminal question from the global North to Latin America in both the academic and policy fields in the past, but also in the present. And I think that this journey through this collective project related to Southern criminology has really enriched my research in this point. And I will use some examples of this during my talk today. Since the appearance of these different texts, there is a growing engagement and discussion on these ideas, both in its political and scientific dimensions in the last few years, in the forms of chapters of books, articles in scientific journals, or even books. So the debate is growing quite a lot. And in fact, we can consider the idea of promoting this discussion group as part of this growing engagement and debate. So first, I want to do some comments on the idea of the South. As you know, it's complex idea, and it has also its problems. There is a long history of binaries that divide the world and establish a term as a final destination: civilized, civilizing, modern, modernizing, developed, developing, industrial, industrializing. The divide between global North and South is also a binary, but is less time-based and more space-based, and try to go beyond a narrative of evolution or succession. But there are still some residues of these past gestures, these past binaries, that we can see in the uses of the distinction between the global North and the South. As you may know, this distinction was in some way diffused at the beginning of the 1980s in its first uses by the Brand Commission, the Independent Commission on International Development Issues, that drew a map of the globe, of the world, dividing the global North and South using the growth domestic product per capita to draw the line of division between rich and poor countries. But in the last 10, 20 years, the social sciences debate around the idea of the South has moved beyond these fixed geographical categories and tried to develop a more dynamic conception of the South as a metaphor, of the North and South as a metaphor of relations of domination and dependency between privileged and underprivileged regions of the world, which has been historically built through different colonial and neo-colonial processes and mechanisms. Within this framework, the borders of the South become complex, and it is necessary to avoid rigid outlines, as it has been shown in the different arguments around the North in the South and the South in the North in the recent literature, for example, the work by Elliot Carey or David Fonseca. So the South, in this perspective, cannot be thought of as an homogeneous entity, but is permeated by multiple economic, social, political, and cultural differences and inequalities that are also present in the production and circulation of knowledge in the academic field. So there are different ways of being in the South in relation to the production and circulation of knowledge in the academic field. It's not the same to be in Australia than to be in Ecuador. So the distinction between semi-periphery and periphery, a distinction that, as you all know, came from the world system theory, could be adapted to at least differentiate two basic positions inside the global South, even when there is a continuum of different situations beyond the core that probably this binary distinction between semi-periphery and periphery could also obscure. But we can use it, as has been proposed in several recent texts, for example, by Juanjo Medina 10 years ago, in order to think about the production and circulation of knowledge in the academic field across this divide between the global North and South. So considering this way of thinking about the South, probably the main set of arguments of this perspective, Southern criminology, as we labeled it some 5 years ago, is to explore the hierarchy, dependency, and subordination in the production of criminological knowledge. So there has been profound inequalities among different places in the world as regards the production of and circulation of criminological knowledge in broad terms. I am using here criminology not as a synonym of a discipline, because as you all know, in many different regions of the world, the process of institutionalization of the social scientific knowledge around the criminal question has had different paths, and in some regions of the world, the expression criminology and the idea that criminology is a discipline is still contested. It is an idea that has a lot of a lot of opposition in many contexts, particularly of the regions that we usually think of in relation to the global south, as for example in Latin America. So there has been profound inequalities among different places in the world in the production and circulation of criminological knowledge in this sense since its inception and throughout its history, which has implied a strong predominance of problems, concepts, and arguments produced in the north over those produced in the south, both in the periphery or semi-periphery. This predominance is rooted, though in a complex way, in wider economic, political, and cultural inequalities that have been shaped by imperialism in its different forms throughout history up to our present as a long-term basic phenomena. This predominance is produced by and produces the style northern intellectuals use to formulate their concepts and arguments as if they were universal, timeless, and placeless, obscuring the fact that they refer to processes and dynamics that are rooted in certain places and at certain times, that have their own distinctive features, jumping easily to broad generalizations. This, in turn, often lets Southern scholars, or more properly speaking, scholars in the South, to import these problems, concepts, and arguments from the North in an acritical way and to apply them to their own context, which prevents them from developing significant innovations. By doing so, they operate as suppliers of local empirical data, which reinforces the universal, placeless, and timeless tone that the global North intellectuals use when they produce their own perspectives. So there are many reasons that play a role in this hierarchy, dependency, and subordination in the production of criminological knowledge. There are symbolic elements that are related with the aspiration to the incorporation to civilization, development, modernity, in which the global North appears as a benchmark, a normative benchmark for the global South, including the global South intellectuals. And there is a long history of this symbolic element playing a crucial role in this hierarchy, dependency, and subordination in the production of criminological knowledge. But also there are some material elements related with the limitations of opportunities and resources to do research in several contexts of the global South. This process also in some way reflects in, beyond the academic field, the strong role of transfers of institutions and practices of crime control between the global North and South, both in the past and in the present, from the prison or the police to plea bargaining or neighborhood watch. So there is a long history also of this hierarchy, dependency, and subordination related not with the academic field, but with the policy fields in the global South. So analyzing these general characteristics about hierarchy, dependency, and subordination in the production of criminological knowledge has not to take us to avoid considering the challenges and resistances through the history of criminology in the global South. Throughout the history of this field, it is possible to find moments of theoretical invention by local intellectuals born out of exploring local problems and context, as well as adaptations of imported elements which result in real metamorphoses of vocabularies from the North, with the aim of making them fit the problems and context in the South. There are several examples. I have been doing research on this in the past and also in the present, particularly around positivist criminology. But one key example from my perspective is the discussion on dependency and subordination in this field of knowledge during the birth of critical criminology in Latin America in the 1970s and the 1980s. One crucial example is the work by Eugenio Raúl Zaffaroni, one of the key intellectuals in this movement of the birth of critical criminology in Latin America, who has even coined a position, an aim for a position around this problem of dependency and subordination that he labeled marginal criminological realism, using marginal in a sense that is close to the idea of periphery that we have already mentioned. There are also examples in this long history of south-south travels or even south-north diffusions, which should also be identified and explored through, though recognizing they are relatively exceptional and weak in comparison with the north-south fluxes. So an important task for Southernising criminology is the in-depth exploration of these stories in the remote and recent past in order to unearth moments of inventiveness and innovation, identifying its conditions and dynamics as a source of inspiration for contemporary research. Southern criminology, as an expression, seems to propose opening up a new branch within the already highly fragmented field of criminology. In our text with my friends and colleagues, Carrington, Hawke, Scott, Walters, we have explicitly opposed this possibility, as we believe to be counterproductive in several ways. However, it is worth recognizing that it is the expression in itself that encourages this type of interpretation, which therefore makes it necessary to find other ways of presenting these arguments in order to avoid this kind of reception. We have actually moved forward in this direction by elaborating on the idea of Southernising criminology that we use here in the title of this presentation. So what does entails? First, of course, entails to recognize, as we have already seen, both the past and present of hierarchy, dependency, and subordination in the production of criminological knowledge. Second, it entails identifying the challenges throughout the history of criminology in the Global South to these dynamics of hierarchization, dependency, and subordination. I think that researchers working both in the South and in the North should turn each of these ways of thinking and acting that produces and reproduces hierarchy, dependency, and subordination in the production of criminological knowledge into an object of exploration and critical reflection. In order to avoid reproducing these ways of thinking, Southern researchers that try to Southernize criminology should build their own research agendas based on a deep encounter with their own context in the past and in the present, by different means, identifying their own problems and trying to build their own perspectives. Of course, this is easy to say, but much more difficult to do. So this invitation has a strong coincidence with the colonial, post-colonial, counter-colonial perspectives, the aim of situating at the center of our gaze the history and present of imperialism and colonization and its multiple effects in the ways of thinking in the field of criminology, as well in the institutions and practices of crime control in contemporary societies, is something that we can see as a very strong coincidence, a very strong agreement. In some corners of contemporary post-colonial, decolonial, counter-colonial approaches, we can see appeals to a sort of purification of our gaze from traces of novel theories and methodologies, failing into a sort of dualism that includes an evocation of a local tradition of thought that could be reconstructed beyond the processes and legacies of colonization and neo-colonization. And this tradition would be the source for building their own agenda and perspective for researchers doing research in the post-colonial or Southern contexts. I think that this could be reasonably possible in relation to some problems and questions, as has been recently pursuing important works in relation to indigenous criminology, particularly in the work by Chris Kooning and Juan Tauri. However, there, there are constantly risks of romanticization, of reproducing binary categories of thought that has been created by metropolitan thinking and generating oppositionism that produces a closure in the possibilities of dialogue and translates into what Pat Carlin have named a decade ago forms of evangelism. So, but I think that in relation to other problems and questions, this route in order to build our own agendas and perspective seems much more problematic. One example that for me is quite interesting is all the debate in the social sciences in the last 10 years around the dynamics of prison governance in Latin America. It's quite difficult to think about and do research on this, separating ourselves completely of the debates around the global north prisons. Of course, we constantly see things that are different to the ones that have been seen by researchers in prison studies in the global north. And in the last 10 years, the literature has shown the emergence, for example, of concepts like co-governance or shared governance that are quite interesting as alternatives to think power relations inside Latin American prisons, or at least inside some Latin American prisons. But as I have argued in a paper that I have published recently in Spanish, you know, in order to think about co-governance or shared governance, we can identify a source of inspiration in the classical works of the prison sociology in the global north, particularly in the Society of Captives by Gresham Sykes, who have identified in the 1950s in the US the role of some prisoners as a key to understand the production of order inside prisons in the 1950s in that national context. So we can build a dialogue with this precedent. We can use Sykes not to say exactly the same things as Sykes have said, but to say different things. But we can engage in a dialogue and use of these concepts that could be useful in order to build our own perspectives. And I think that this example could be replicated in many other themes in relation to prison life in contemporary Latin American context, but also in other regions of the global south. So in relation to these problems and questions, the Southernizing perspective incarnates a less ambitious and radical attitude. It tries to discuss problems, arguments, and concepts produced in the global north, taking into consideration their embeddedness, as Melosi has put it 20 years ago, or its situatedness, as Katia Francois has remembered 10 years ago, in past and present contexts and processes, and to decenter its use in order to understand local problems and contexts in the South. As Dipesh Chakrabarty proposed, it entails provincializing Europe, provincializing the global north, and develop some sort of conceptual pragmatism, departing from a thick encounter with the empirical moment in the South as a source of inventiveness and innovation. In this sense, Southernising Criminology proposes an objective that is related with the construction of a balanced and horizontal dialogue between knowledge producers in the global north and south in pursuit of what Boaventura de Sousa Santos have labeled cognitive justice. It entails democratized, pluralized, decenter criminology by injecting it with voices from the semi-periphery and the periphery, with their experiences and processes, their empirical and theoretical research. Of course, Southernising Criminology is an open-ended journey that is not only important for those who work on the global south, but also for those who do it in the north, and how they think the production of their own concepts and arguments in relation to the problem of generalization. We already said probably too many things in order to justify why we have to Southernize criminology, but what is really needed is to do it. And as I already said, it's easier to say it than doing it. There are huge difficulties, and many of them have been highlighted in the recent debate around these texts on Southern criminology, from the prevalence or the dominance of English as a lingua franca in the production of knowledge in the criminological field, to the insufficient funds to do research in many contexts of the global South. The challenge is enormous, but by step, we can see in recent years important advances, from conferences to books, from articles that has been published in very important central academic journals of the global North, to the emergence of new journals, open access journals, more democratic journals like the International Journal of Crime, Justice and Social Democracy that was originated by my colleagues in Australia, particularly by Kerry Carrington, to this, even this discussion group, that it's another proof of these small steps that we can see in the more general debate. I think that I have done it in 30 minutes. That is quite strange for me. Thank you. I think that I have ended my sharing of the screen. Is this okay? Yeah, great.
Thank you so much, Professor Sozzo, and I hope other members of the audience can join me in giving you a virtual round of applause.